Hello and compliments of the season. We welcome our viewers in Nigeria and around the world to the program Road to 2023. I am Imonia Marere. It's less than 3 days to the new year, 2023, and that also means that we are inching closer to the much anticipated general elections in Nigeria. The first of which will come up on February 25th, 2023. As usual, we shall assist you to navigate all the known and even the unknown bends and corners on the road to the 2023 elections. Now, ahead of the elections, a number of international and local election observer groups have been busy carrying out assessments of the electoral environment around the country and making valuable recommendations on how to improve the electoral process in 2023. One such group is the Joint National Democratic Institute, NDI, and the International Republican Institute, IRI mission. A delegation of the joint mission has concluded a second pre-election assessment process as part of his observation of the 2023 polls. The second mission was conducted between December 4 and 9 and builds on the first assessment mission, which took place in July. Now, a recently released report of the delegation identified some critical issues which it says must be addressed before Election Day to promote what he describes as an inclusive, transparent, credible, and peaceful electoral process. In the mission's view, despite the important electoral reforms contained in the Electoral Act 2022, which have raised public confidence in the electoral system, a number of challenges and concerns remain. On the program today, we shall take an in-depth look at the mission's 9-page report and try to unravel some of the identified challenges. We shall be joined by the country director of the International Republican Institute, Mr. Santiago Stocker. Now, as you are well aware, politicians have been busy capitalizing on the festive season to reach out in various ways to the electorates in the hope of swaying them to their parties and candidates in next year's elections. While some have been operating locally, others have been taking their consultations to foreign lands. Now, the rumblings in some of the political parties, with just about 1 month, 3 weeks to the elections, continue unabated. Defections are also ongoing. And will this be the trend until Election Day? Well, let's review some of the political developments that happened during the Yuletide on our political tidbits segment.
Hello and welcome to Political Tidbits. I am Funke Ogunlolu. The crisis in the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, appears to be festering as the G5 governors have held another round of meeting in the United Kingdom, UK, to decide on who to support as presidential candidates in the 23 general elections. The 5 governors, Nyesom Wike from Rivers State, Seyi Makinde Oyo, Samuel Otom Benue, Okeze Ikpeazu Abia, and Ifeanyi Ugwuanyi Enugu State, have been at loggerheads with the leadership of the party over demand for the national chairmanship of the party to be zoned to the south and the subsequent resignation of Senator Iyorchia Ayu. The G5 governors under the aegis of the Integrity Group are leaving no stone unturned in driving home their grievances ahead of the 23 general elections. Wike had in a broadcast said he will unveil his choice of presidential candidate in January 2023. Now, the presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, and former Vice President Atiku Abubakar has warned the Rivers State Governor, Nyesom Wike, and 4 other aggrieved governors in the party against their alleged plot to dump him for a rival presidential candidate, saying any such decision will end their political careers. The spokesperson of the Atiku Campaigns Council, Dino Melaye, who spoke on behalf of the presidential candidate, said Atiku will not give room for any distraction. Labour Party has replaced the Director General of its Presidential Campaign Council, Doyin Okupe, with a former aide to ex-President Olusegun Obasanjo, Akin Osuntokun. The national chairman of the party, Julius Abure, announced the replacement after an emergency meeting in Abuja. The former DG, Doyin Okupe, resigned his position after he was convicted of money laundering by a federal high court earlier this month. The new DG, Akin Osuntokun, is a political scientist, researcher, administrator, journalist, and writer with varied experiences in media advocacy, policy research, and political analyst. Osuntokun's appointment has, however, thrown up another round of controversy in the party. Some members of the party, led by the suspended National Publicity Secretary, Abayomi Arabambi, have kicked against the appointment on grounds that Akin Osuntokun is not a member of the party and is, in fact, a senatorial candidate of the Zenith Labour Party, the ZLP, for Ekiti Central in the 2023 elections, and can therefore not be the Director General of the Labour Party Presidential Council. Arabambi called on Osuntokun to resign his appointment or face a legal challenge. Arabambi and his group had earlier expelled the former DG, Doyin Okupe, from the party before his travails in court. An international election observer group, Connected Development, has called on religious and community-based organizations in Kogi State to unite and prevent election violence ahead of 2023 general elections in the state. Speaking at a sensitization program of interreligious groups organized by Ibira Community Agenda for Peace held in Okene, the chief executive of Connected Development, Hamzat Lawal, also called on the relevant authorities in the media to ensure dissemination of accurate information to the people.
Let us dialogue and ensure that peace is in the center of our democracy and the forthcoming election. I believe that community and religious leaders can and should be on the front burner to drive this issue of peace and prosperity. And we should ensure that law enforcement agents arrest and prosecute people who are propagating hate speech, fake news, misinformation, and disinformation.
3 persons, including a police inspector, have been reportedly killed during the gunfight that erupted at Ekolie in Afikpo South Council area of Ebonyi State over a power tussle among the All Progressives Congress political gladiators. The Boxing Day incident between operatives of the Ebuwea Grove security outfit attached to the Ebonyi State chairman of the All Progressives Congress, Stanley Emega, and some armed youths alleged to be loyalists to the immediate past chairman of the council area, who is also the party's House of Representatives candidate, Eniuduma Chima, equally had the home of the APC boss set ablaze. Governor David Umahi has visited the troubled community and ordered immediate arrest and prosecution of both Stanley Ekoro Emega and Eniuduma Chima. Now, the governorship candidate of the Social Democratic Party, SDP, in Rivers State, Senator Magnus Zabi, has accused the chairman of Tai local government area of the state, Mbakone Okwe, of leading thugs to vandalize the party secretariat in Nonwa-Tai. Abe made the allegation while speaking at his campaign office in Port Harcourt immediately after returning from the scene of the alleged attack. He called on political leaders in the state to stop sponsoring attacks against opponents. However, the spokesperson of the Rivers State Police Command, Grace Iringe Koko, in a telephone conversation with AIT, said the vandalization of the SDP secretariat was carried out by supporters of the SDP. Also reacting to the allegation, the spokesperson of Rivers State PDP Governorship Campaign Council, Ogbonaya Nwoke, dissociated the PDP from the attack and expressed worry over the hasty accusation by the SDP candidate for an attack that happened in a PDP-dominated tie. He said no rational member of the PDP would stoop so low as to carry out such an attack on an opponent.
I spoke with the Commissioner of Police, and he assured us that security had been provided. But these people went there and destroyed everything. And were insisting that I cannot come to Tai to talk to the people of Tai or to open the office. And much to our surprise, the few policemen that were posted to the place withdrew, telling us that we needed better signals, that they cannot withstand what was going on.
The governorship candidate of the Young Progressives Party, YPP, Senator Bassel Albert Akpan, has been granted post-conviction bail by a federal high court in Port Harcourt, Rivers State. Akpan was granted bail on health grounds and is set to be released from the University Teaching Hospital, Uyo, where he was taken for checkup after his health reportedly deteriorated while at the Ikot Ekpene Correctional Center. The senator was convicted on December 1st, 2022 by a federal high court in Uyo, Akwa Ibom State and sentenced to 42 years in prison. He was charged by the Economic Financial Crime Commission, the EFCC, for receiving 12 cars worth 250 million naira from oil magnate Olajide Omokore while he was serving as Commissioner for Finance in the Godswill Akpabio's administration. He is currently the senator representing Akwa Ibom Northeast in the Nigerian Senate. The All Progressives Grand Alliance, APGA, said it is confident of victory in 2023 general elections as it announced January 14, 2023 to flag off its presidential campaign in Anambra State. The national chairman of the party, Victor Oye, in a statement said the party has all it takes to come victorious. And finally, the governorship candidate of the All Progressives Congress, APC, in Cross River State, Senator Bassel Otu, has suspended his political activities in honor of persons who lost their lives during the 2022 Calabar Bikers Carnival in the state. Otu, in a statement issued by his media assistant, Ekpenyong Akibo, said the unfortunate and tragic death of some residents in Cross River State who left their homes to watch the Bikers Parade came to him as a rude shock. He commiserated with the families of those who lost their lives. And that's all for today's edition of Political Tidbits. I am Funke Ogulolu. Do enjoy your holidays.
Well, the holidays are over, at least until next week, when there will be another holiday to mark the New Year Day celebration. But for now, everyone is back to work, and let's get it going. And now to our talking point today, which is on the findings of the pre-election assessment by the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute mission to Nigeria. The delegation says it met with an array of election stakeholders, including the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, and civil society groups, amongst others, and that it conducted its activities in accordance with the laws of Nigeria and the 2005 United Nations Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation. The NDI and IRI categorize themselves as non-partisan, non-governmental, non-profit organizations that support and strengthen democratic institutions and practices worldwide and have been in Nigeria since the 1999 transition program from military to civilian democratic rule. I'm joined now in the studio by Mr. Santiago Stocker. He is the country director, the International Republican Institute in Nigeria. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome. All right, so let's talk a bit about the mission, the joint mission of the NDI and the IRI. There have been two missions.
Correct.
Pre-election missions. why did you decide to conduct 2 pre-election missions?
Sure, absolutely. So first, let me say thank you for having me on to talk about the assessments of our 2 organizations, which, as you noted, are focused on advancing democracy around the world and here in Nigeria. So we conducted 2 pre-election assessments. The first was in July of this year. And the purpose of doing that is to be able to assess when there's still a great deal of time left before the election. So in that first assessment, we made 24 recommendations to key stakeholders, assessing the electoral landscape at that point in time, which coincided with the gubernatorial elections in Ekiti and Osun, which was the first time the new Electoral Act had been implemented on the ground, and which was happening right when the major presidential tickets were still being solidified. So, and when voter registration, the voter registration window was still open, and before the campaign season formally kicked off in September. So that was a particular moment in time where our delegation assessed the landscape, spoke with key stakeholders, and made key recommendations that we thought could be implemented in that remaining time window. The purpose of this second assessment, which was conducted just a few weeks ago in December, was to understand which of those recommendations had been implemented, to assess the landscape now that the tickets are known, that many of the court cases have been sorted out, that the campaign season is well underway, and now we only have, at this point, less than 2 months. So the second assessment was to take a hard look at the electoral landscape at the first set of recommendations, and then to make specific recommendations that are actionable by key stakeholders in this very short window of time we have between now and February 25th.
Mm. Now, a logical question to ask as a follow-up to that would be, what's the modus operandi, the processes that the joint mission followed in carrying out this assessment?
Sure. So what our delegations seek to do when we bring these high-level delegations here to Nigeria is to speak with a broad array of stakeholders. So what we seek to do is to hear as many voices as possible from the government side, from security forces, from the Electoral Commission, from civil society. Nigeria, of course, has a very robust civil society, from socio-cultural groups, and from all of the various stakeholders that are really invested in the election. And so we try to cast a very wide net and speak with everybody who's willing to speak with our delegations to understand their concerns, their hopes, their recommendations about the election, including political parties, including major presidential candidates. So the whole spectrum of stakeholders that are watching this election and invested in this election, and might have concerns or recommendations that we can then elevate through this report.
Mm. There are very many observer missions that come in and out of Nigeria during elections like this. Are there specific things that the NDI, IRI mission was looking for or was targeting to see whether or not the situation, the electoral environment is good enough or ripe enough for the 2023 elections? Were there things, specific things, especially after the first mission? The second mission then happened. In between, were there specific pointers?
Absolutely. So some of the issues that most concerned us from the first assessment had to do with electoral offenses, the enforcement of the electoral offense provisions of the new Electoral Act, the conduct of political parties, the insecurity landscape, and especially election-related violence and violence involving political parties and political operatives. We were also very concerned with the inclusiveness of the electoral landscape, the ability of IDPs to vote, the ability of people to register. At the time, our delegation recommended that the window be extended beyond July 31st. We were concerned with all of these kind of procedural aspects that might improve the legitimacy of the election, and those are the items that we focused on in this second assessment in December.
So now let's look at what you may consider to be your key findings from the first and the second missions.
Sure. So in both missions, the delegations noted a high degree of enthusiasm among Nigerians to participate and to vote, which is very positive. And also, what I would say is a cautious sense of optimism. So we've had this significant surge of voter registration, especially among young people. In 2022, I think 84% of new registrants were under 34 years or younger. We saw the new Electoral Act, which, when it was finally passed, has been widely accepted and applauded as by almost all stakeholders as a really important step forward. We saw the elections in Ekiti and Osun, which procedurally were very smooth. There were issues with vote buying, which are quite significant, but were very smooth. So a sense of cautious optimism. I think also a high expectation, a high degree of expectation. Nigerians writ large are concerned with the state of the economy, the state of insecurity. There are a lot of challenges facing the country, but there's a great deal of confidence, I would say, that democracy is still the best way to deliver on these issues. If you look at a recent survey that Afrobarometer did, I think over 70% of Nigerians still believe that democracy is better than all of the other systems. So there's also an expectation that this election will be better than previous elections. And then, of course, there are challenges. And so both in the first assessment and in this follow-up assessment, I would group these challenges into two buckets. There are concerns related to the legitimacy and perceived legitimacy of the process, and there are concerns about insecurity. And so those are concerns that we highlighted in the first report and made recommendations, and that we've followed up on in the second report with recommendations that are more specific and timely. Some of the recommendations we made in the first report were followed through, which is very positive. Some of them were not. Now we're where we are, and we have this short window of time. So as opposed to making very broad recommendations, we've looked at what's potentially achievable with a more specific and actionable set in this latest report.
We'll try and look at the two buckets,
Sure.
as you put it, a bit deeper. But first, the IRI and the NDI have been in Nigeria since 1999.
Yes.
And it has observed and monitored elections in Nigeria since then. In your view, have there been any major landmark improvements in the electoral process over these last 22, 23 years?
So I can speak to the current electoral landscape and the way that the Nigerians we've spoken with have assessed the reforms that we have in place now, as opposed to the prior elections, where we do have previous reports that are available and can shed light on how prior delegations have assessed those elections. But in terms of process, electronic transmission is the cornerstone of the increased sense of confidence in this election across the board. When we speak with stakeholders, there are other pieces from the Electoral Act that are accepted and pointed to as very positive, but the electronic transmission is really the central piece of that. That's a huge procedural, technical improvement over prior elections, as well as the iRev portal. So the fact that the BVAS will be used to transmit the results, the fact that voters can access the iRev portal and look at their polling units and the results and see if it's the same number and the same results that they witnessed in person. Those are very important developments. And in fact, we've made some because they're so central to the legitimacy and the credibility of the process, we've recommended that INEC conduct a national stress test on the BVAS and the iRev It's one thing to have those systems function in one state of, in Ekiti, and then in one state, Osun. It's going to be very different for 176,000 polling units across 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. So that's a big improvement, but again, there are concerns about how it will function. And this is the case, I think, across a lot of the improvements, right? There is an IDP framework, for example, which was released in September, which was a welcome development. We still don't know if the INEC commissioners have completed the surveys of the IDPs in their states, which was a key piece that needs to happen to ensure that they're included in an equitable way. And so in many respects, there are building blocks in place, but concerns about the degree to which they will be fully implemented. Another, the voter roll has been released and subject to scrutiny. There are many outstanding questions about which criteria are used to remove voters, to how underage voters are dealt with, how double registrants are dealt with. Is INEC informing people that they've been removed? How are they informing people? PVC collection, we have now started the process at the LGA level. Many people we've talked to have had difficulty accessing their PVCs. It's supposed to be decentralized or devolved to the ward level on January 6th, which is a positive development. But again, will those cards be ready at the ward level? And so for all of these building blocks that are positive steps, there are these outstanding challenges. And that's why this window between now and the election is so critical.
Let's talk a bit about the national stress test that the delegation recommended. From this time to the first election on February 25th, just about a month and 3 weeks, less than 2 months. How much time does the Independent National Electoral Commission have to carry out such a national stress test, considering that there are over 176,000 polling units across the country, which will, if that test was to be conducted, will amount to, in fact, conducting a whole election?
Yeah, so we'll leave it to the technical experts, right, in terms of how that test would be conducted and how many, which level of resources and investment of time it would require. The point that we're making in the assessment is that the credibility, the perceived credibility and confidence in this election and in the new electoral processes hinges on electronic transmission. And so INEC needs to take very seriously the potential for failures on election day. And whatever they can do to stress test the BVAS, the IREV between now and then should be done. Because problems on election day are going to undermine the legitimacy of the entire process. And that's something that that INEC doesn't want and that Nigerians don't want. And so we're not making specific technical recommendations to INEC. They're the experts. They have great access to technical experts in this field. What we're saying is, because it's so central to the credibility of the process, anticipate the potential for failure and do whatever you can to get ahead of that in this period of time.
And talking about credibility, the delegation did say that it's impressed with what he described as improvements in the Nigerian electoral framework. Yet it is concerned that confidence in government and the elections, which it categorizes, and I quote them, as the lowest in Africa, may be further eroded. Why this level of pessimism?
So I think the survey you're citing there was a Gallup survey that noted that there was low confidence. So that wasn't our assessment. That was an objective third-party survey. But I think in speaking to Nigerian stakeholders, there is, as I said, yes, cautious optimism, but there are a lot of challenges and a lot of concerns about the process and the state of the country, but also an expectation that this election is going to be a vehicle for meaningful change, right? And it's a great opportunity for that. It's the first, open seat since 2007, multiple viable candidates. Whoever wins will represent a new direction for the country. So there is that optimism, but there's also, significant challenges that voters are concerned with. And the point that the delegation was making and that Nigerians communicated to us is that the stakes are high. Expectations are high. This election has to be better than prior elections. And so when Professor Yakubu noted that this will be the best election Nigeria has ever had, I think in the assessment of our delegation and many Nigerians, it needs to be. It's a different time and a different dynamic than 2019, and there is a real desire that this election is an avenue for Nigerians to address these challenges that the country is facing, and that if these building blocks that have been put in place in terms of electoral reforms on all of these issues we've talked about, if they're not implemented well and executed upon successfully, it would be very counterproductive.
Now, reading through that report, I've taken some time to go through, I get the impression that the mission was a bit more concerned about just the presidential elections. Yet, there are going to be other elections. For instance, the governorship elections are going to take place in at least 26 states of the Federation, state houses of assembly elections in all the 36 states of the Federation, and of course there will be senatorial and House of Representative elections. So I was wondering in my mind, why so much concern or so much focus on the presidential elections and not so much on the other elections? Those elections are the ones that are closer to the Nigerian people, to the ordinary persons in the various states and local governments.
Sure, that's a great question. Those elections are extremely important, and in some respects more important. There's of course, different things are at stake at the presidential level versus the gubernatorial level. Our focus is on the presidential election, but I would say that our observations and recommendations also apply to these other elections. And in fact, we've observed Ekiti and Osun as a test case for how the presidential and other elections will go, implementing these new provisions from the Electoral Act. So recommendations and observations, I think, are relevant across both sets of elections. Our focus is the presidential, but you rightly point out that the other elections are just as important. I would also say, though, that the presidential election is held first on February 25th, and so if that goes well, if that's a success, then that will have a positive, I think, effect on the gubernatorial elections that follow. And if it goes poorly and the new Electoral Act is not well executed and Nigerians do not see it as a credible process, then that will be very problematic for the gubernatorial elections. So while we're focusing on the presidential election, what we do and what other observation missions do will have implications for, I think, all of the elections next year.
One of the recommendations that the delegation made was for the federal government to continue messaging to governors and security forces to remain impartial throughout the electoral process because of what has happened in the recent past. But the question is, how do you really expect state governors who are partisans, who were elected on party platforms, to be impartial? And what kind of impartiality are you expecting them to display in their support? Some of them are even leading the campaigns of some presidential candidates. How possible, how realistic, how feasible is it to expect them to be impartial?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we've heard from Nigerians is not the expectation that governors be nonpartisan. Of course, governors belong to political parties and are politically active. What Nigerians are telling us and what we're saying in our assessment is they need to follow the law. And when it comes to campaigns, when it comes to candidates seeking access to venues, for example, to hold rallies, they should be permitted to do that within the scope of the law. When it comes to advertising for campaigns, they should be permitted to do that without fear that their materials will be destroyed and vandalized. When it comes to campaigning, the idea that if you want to go and campaign in a state that is a party stronghold of another party, you can reasonably expect at this point that your convoy might be attacked, your supporters might be attacked and beaten, that you'll be subjected to violence, merely for trying to reach voters and talk to them about what you're hoping to do and why you're running for office. That's unacceptable. So what we're hearing from Nigerians is governors also need to follow the law. We've welcomed what we've seen from the executive branch and security forces in terms of also communicating this to governors. We've welcomed what we've heard from the police in terms of their willingness to remove police commissioners who are partisan. And we hope that that commitment continues. There has to be a level playing field if it's going to be a democratic election. And one of the biggest risks is you can have a procedurally sound election, but if governors and security forces and political parties act poorly and in a partisan fashion so that it's not a level playing field, it will not be perceived to be a credible process. And all of that work that's been done to improve the process will be out the window. And so that's the scenario that really needs to be avoided.
Now, your organizations, both the NGI and RI, have monitored elections in so many countries around the world. At least what I know of is over 30 countries around the world. What do you consider to be the best practices in this situation where there is a president who is not running for office, who's not not going to be on the ballot, but you do have governors, state governors, and other critical political stakeholders who are going to be on the ballot? What do you consider should be the best practice in this situation? What would be your recommendation to INEC and to the political parties and the what you describe as the critical stakeholders in this entire process?
Sure. So, as you alluded to, open seat elections are very important. And this is the first one in Nigeria since 2007. When you have an open seat election, it presents new opportunities and also new challenges. Thankfully, I think from President Buhari has communicated repeatedly his commitment to a legacy of a credible transition. That's very positive. You want the executive to be invested in that transition. You want the law to be followed. And where there are reforms that are implemented, thoughtful reforms put together by experts in consultation with civil society, as we've seen with the 2022 Electoral Act, those laws should be enforced. And so, our recommendation is follow the laws that are in place, execute and implement. The biggest risk is that the laws will not be followed or implemented effectively. And so that's why we've pushed in our report for many of our recommendations are to actually just implement what's already laid out in the law. For example, the executive branch is supposed to fully fund INEC a year before the election. In our assessment, the best that we could estimate is they had received 60%. So there's a good reason because of the immense logistical challenges.
Now, as at the time of your assessment, because the president has come out to say after that he has provided, or the executive has provided everything and all the resources required by INEC.
That would be very welcome. Also, the funding, and again, this was supposed to happen 12 months before. And there's good reason for it because INEC needs to be independent and INEC has immense logistical challenges. And so we had made this recommendation in July. As well as the fully funding the election tribunals. As we all know, no elections in Nigeria occur without the involvement of the courts, and those tribunals need to be impartial. When it comes to vote buying, those laws are on the books. When it comes to the layout of polling units, it's established, although it's often not followed. So all of these pieces are there, but I think in terms of your question, lessons learned for open seats, where the stakes are high, is the key stakeholders need to be committed. There needs to be transparency. The law needs to be followed. And where the law is not being followed, there should be visibility and transparency on that. And that's why it's so important that civil society and the media play their role, that the international community play their role. And one of the recommendations we've made is that where there is involvement, orchestration, support for political violence by partisan operators, that the international community consider targeted sanctions, asset freezes, visa bans. The state of electoral violence since the signing of the peace accord on September 29th has been egregious. We've had incidents, more than 70 incidents, 26 states, more than 60 LGAs, and many of these instances are public, egregious displays of blatant partisan violence. And in many cases, it's hard to understand how these happen without the involvement of people who are officials in those parties and in those campaigns. So that needs to be called out. There needs to be an understanding of the price that will be paid when the law is broken. And that's really, really critical because you want to shape those incentives, and that's what's going to help ensure that there's a credible process.
Mr. Stocker, stay with us. Let's pause a bit and go to our social media segment. That's politics on social media. When we return, we'll continue our interview with Mr. Stocker.
On social media, I am Omari O'Day. With the 2023 general elections fast approaching, the election management body, INEC, political parties and their candidates have been doing their best to create awareness. But are they doing enough? In this video I'm about to show you, somewhere in Bauchi State, some mischief makers have been trying to portray the Labour Party presidential candidate, Peter Obi, as belonging to the People's Democratic Party, PDP.
24th December 2022. So there is a confusion here in Bauchi State that people are saying that Peter Obi is now in PDP. He is together with Atiku. So there is confusion here in Bauchi State. So we want Labour Party to tell our president, our candidate Peter Obi, to come to Bauchi State.
Political parties have a responsibility to ensure that whatever knowledge gap there is bridged nationwide before the polls. Moving on to our next story, the presidential candidate of the new Nigeria People's Party, NNPP, Rabiu Musa Kwankwaso, has been mocking his closest rivals ahead of the 2023 general elections. The former Kano State governor stated in a video released on Twitter why he is the most qualified person to be elected as the country's next president. Let's take a look at our first comments concerning this, shall we? From Abdullahi, who is saying he is the only presidential candidate who can show what he did in the past, not only in Kano State, but also all over the country. Our next comment is coming from KC, who is saying at Kwankwaso, the Nigerian youths are asking you to collapse your structure for Labour Party. The Nigerian youths are asking you to sit on a table with Peter Obi and come to a political agreement in the interest of Nigeria. Moving on to our next comment, number one Peter Obi boy is saying, but why won't the North rally behind Kwankwaso the way the South rallied behind Peter Obi? Finally, concerning this story, the 90s is saying it has never been this fun. Nigeria 2023 politics. I love this. I think this person likes seeing the bright side on everything. Now, moving to our next story, the Presidential Campaign Council of the African Action Congress, AAC candidate Omoyele Sowore, has condemned the recent killings of Nigerians in southern Kaduna and Ehamo communities in Enugu State. The Campaign Council, in a statement on Tuesday, lamented that the President Buhari-led federal government has completely abandoned its basic responsibilities of protecting lives and property of Nigerians. The council promised that an AAC government under Omoyele Sowore would secure the country and set it on a path to sustainable peace and shared prosperity. Very interesting. Let's move over to the comments and see. The first one is from Optimist, who is saying we need rugged people like Sowore to salvage Nigeria from these northern oligarchs. Another APC or PDP or PDAPC's rule would worsen Nigeria's situation. And finally, concerning that story, Evolution Aura is saying, Yele Showore, I like your enthusiasm. Maybe after Peter Obi's 8 years and that is 8 years, we might consider your candidature. Well, that's why we draw the curtains today on politics on social media. I am Omari Ode. Compliments of the season. Back to Amariwe for the rest of the show.
Thank you so much, Omari Ode, there with politics on social media. My guest, Mr. Santiago Stucker, who is the country director of the International Republican Institute, is still very much with me here in the studio. Mr. Stucker, before we went for the social media segment, we're talking about setting concerns about what I would describe as the rituals of peace pledges by political parties, party candidates. Every time there is an election, these accords are signed, but in most cases they are observed in the breach. And that's because some people think essentially that there are no inbuilt sanctions for the pledges that they commit themselves to. So it just becomes one of those things. They just sign these pieces of papers and then go away. Even if they on their own do not commit these acts of violence, their supporters do. They don't call them to order, or they don't hold them to account, and nobody does. In your view, will what you are recommending, I mean your delegation is recommending, for those who you describe as orchestrating violence, perpetrating violence, to have some sanctions, international sanctions, is that enough? Shouldn't there be some sanctions nationally that would serve as deterrence to these acts of violence?
Great question. So first, there are reputational costs for signing a peace accord, for pledging to conduct your campaign in a peaceful manner consistent with the rule of law, and then your followers, your operatives not doing that. And so one of the concerns we heard from stakeholders is all the presidential candidates should sign the peace accord, right, to begin with. It was not signed by all the major presidential candidates. Number two, that they should sign the second peace accord, which is a commitment to accept the results, because that's really critical in the phase after the election. And then in terms of sanctions, that's, you know, the incentives that you talk about, there has to be costs for engaging in violence. And as I noted before, the level of partisan violence since the signing of the peace accord has been egregious and unacceptable. So that's why we've recommended that the international community consider targeted sanctions. It's why we've recommended that the media and civil society play a very strong role in shining a light on this behavior, and why security forces need to enforce the law. These offenses and behaviors are prohibited in the Electoral Act. They're prohibited in the legal code, but enforcement is the issue. Once there is real enforcement and accountability, that will change the incentives and lay the groundwork for a credible, peaceful election.
Mr. Stucker, thank you so much for your time. Mr. Santiago Stucker is the country director, the International Republican Institute. Of course, both the IRI and the NDI have had 2 missions in Nigeria, pre-election missions, conducted those missions in July, and the last one was just a few weeks back, and the pre-election assessment report is being out, and that's what we've been talking about on the program today. Thank you so much for coming on the program. All right, that's a bit for today. Please join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of The Road to 2023. Bye for now.